My mom whispered, "There isn't enough room for any of you," and left my son standing outside. So I took his hand and told her, "You don't get to evict my children from a house you don't pay for." I still remember that Sunday like it was yesterday, even though it's been 8 months. My kids, Tyler, 9 male, and Emma, 7 female, were practically vibrating with excitement in the backseat about seeing their grandparents. Emma had spent all morning making this construction paper card covered in hearts and those foam stickers she's obsessed with for Grandma. Tyler was carefully balancing the chocolate cheesecake we'd picked up from that fancy bakery downtown that my mom always raved about to her friends but secretly complained was too rich when it was just us. You know the type, all about appearances. As I pulled into my parents' familiar suburban driveway in my 2018 Dodge Durango, not the fanciest car, but it was reliable and paid off that familiar knot formed in my stomach, the one I'd been getting since I was a teenager whenever I had to interact with my parents. Their modest split-level home looked the same as always, meticulously maintained outside, emotionally suffocating within. The lawn was perfectly manicured. Not a single dandelion dared to show its face. Dad's prize rose bushes lined the walkway, the same ones I'd been yelled at for accidentally hitting with a baseball when I was 12. I parked behind my sister Melissa's shiny new Audi Q7 leased, though she'd never admit it, and took a deep breath. "All right, troops, remember what we talked about," I said to the kids, meeting their eyes in the rearview mirror. "Best behavior, and if anything makes you uncomfortable, just give me the signal." The signal was tugging their earlobe, something we'd worked out after the last disastrous visit, when my dad had made Tyler cry by criticizing his little league batting stance for 20 straight minutes. When we knocked, my mother Diane opened the door, her practiced smile instantly faltering when she saw the kids. She was wearing one of her church dresses even though it was just family dinner. Her hair freshly colored that particular shade of blonde that's supposed to hide the gray but actually just makes women of a certain age look like they're trying too hard. "Jack, we weren't expecting the children," she whispered, pulling me aside while my kids stood awkwardly on the porch. The smell of her too-strong perfume made my nose itch. "We talked about this Tuesday," I said firmly. "I specifically mentioned bringing them." She glanced nervously behind her, lowering her voice even more. "We only set places for the adults and Melissa's children. There simply isn't enough room." Looking past her, I could see the dining room table perfectly set with my father Richard at the head, my younger sister Melissa, and her 3 kids already seated. At 38, I'd spent most of my adult life trying to win my parents' approval. After college, I'd gotten a solid job in pharmaceutical sales that had me traveling across 3 states. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well enough that I could support my own family and still bail out my parents whenever they called with their endless emergencies. I was good at it too, consistently in the top 10% of salespeople in my region. Not that my parents ever acknowledged that. According to them, I just got lucky landing the job because my college roommate's dad put in a good word. Never mind the fact that I'd worked my backside off through college with 2 jobs while maintaining a 3.8 GPA. Never mind that I'd risen through the ranks on my own merit. My wife Laura was waiting in the car. She'd stopped coming to these family dinners months ago after my mother had made one too many passive-aggressive comments about her parenting. "I'll just grab drive-through and eat at home," she said. "It's not worth the drama." I should have listened to her. 22 years. That's how long I'd been their personal bank. Since my first paycheck at 16 working at the mall food court, I'd been handing over money. College fund. They used it to pay their property taxes when dad lost his job. Wedding savings gone. When mom needed dental work they couldn't afford despite their annual cruises. Down payment for our first house, delayed 3 years because Melissa needed help with her student loans after dropping out of her 3rd attempt at college. Just last month they had called asking for $2,400 for a critical roof repair, which I later found out from their neighbor was actually to help Melissa make a down payment on her new car after she totaled her previous one while texting and driving. The neighbor had mentioned it casually, not realizing I didn't know. "Your sister sure is lucky to have such generous parents helping her with that new Audi after that accident," he'd said, while I was dropping off a package that had been delivered to their house by mistake. Standing there watching Tyler look up at me with confusion in his eyes, "Dad, what's happening?" Something inside me finally broke. Maybe it was seeing his face so innocent and unaware of the decades of manipulation I'd endured. Maybe it was remembering how my father had missed Tyler's birthday party last year because Melissa's daughter had a dance recital the same day. Or maybe it was just the final straw after years of being treated like an ATM with legs. "We're leaving," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I felt a strange calm wash over me, like when you finally make a decision you've been putting off for years. Diane grabbed my arm, digging her manicured nails into my bicep. "Don't be ridiculous, Jack." Her voice had that saccharine tone she used when she was trying to manipulate me in front of others, sweet on the surface, threatening underneath. I stood my ground, feeling the muscles in my jaw tighten. At 6 feet 2 inches and 215 pounds, down from 240 after I'd started hitting the gym regularly last year, stress relief and all that, I wasn't the chubby pushover I'd been in my youth. I'd built myself up physically, at least, even if emotionally I was still letting myself be walked all over. I'm not being ridiculous. I'm being a father, and starting today, I'm no longer paying your mortgage. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's fork clattered against his plate. What did you just say to your mother? He demanded, his voice having that edge that used to make me flinch as a kid. At 67, his hair was mostly gray now, but he still had the imposing build of the college football linebacker he once was, with forearms thick as ham hocks from 40 years as a construction foreman before he'd retired. You heard me, I replied, squaring my shoulders. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I refused to back down. Not this time. Find someone else to fund your lifestyle while you treat their children like unwanted guests. Melissa snorted from her seat at the table. Are you seriously threatening mom and dad over a seating arrangement? Goodness, you always were so sensitive. At 35, she still had the bratty attitude of the spoiled teenager she'd once been. 3 kids from 2 different failed marriages hadn't matured her one bit. I looked at my sister, the perpetual favorite, never held accountable for anything. This isn't about blasted chairs, Melissa. This is about 2 decades of being treated like an ATM while being made to feel like I'm imposing whenever I show up. My voice was getting louder, but I didn't care. 20-plus years of bottled-up resentment was finally finding an outlet. Richard stood up, knocking his chair back. After everything we've sacrificed for you? His face was turning that dangerous shade of red I remembered from childhood arguments. I laughed. Actually laughed right in his face. It felt amazing, like releasing a pressure valve. What exactly have you sacrificed? Because, from where I'm standing, all you've done is take my money and make my children feel worthless. I took my kids' hands. Come on, guys. Let's go get burgers. As we walked out, I heard Diane's panicked whisper to Richard. They weren't upset about losing me. They were terrified of losing access to my wallet. In the car, Emma asked in a small voice, Daddy, why doesn't Grandma like us? That question hit me harder than any punch I'd taken during my boxing days in college. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Tyler put his arm around his little sister, showing more emotional intelligence at 9 than my parents had in their entire lives. It's not you, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have problems that have nothing to do with kids. But inside, I was making a vow. Never again. My children wouldn't grow up feeling the way I had, like they were somehow defective or unworthy of love. The cycle ended with me. Laura looked at me with concern when we all piled back into the car. That was fast, she said, noticing my grim expression and the kids' confused faces. I'll explain later, I mumbled, not wanting to get into it in front of the kids. Who wants 5 guys? The cheer from the backseat lifted my spirits a little, but my mind was racing with what I'd just done. Had I really just cut off my parents financially after all these years? Part of me was terrified, but another part, a part that had been silent for too long, felt something close to relief. The next week passed in blessed silence. No calls from my parents, though. Melissa bombarded me with texts ranging from guilt-tripping to straight-up verbal abuse. I blocked her number after she suggested Laura had turned me against my real family. The irony of her using the phrase real family wasn't lost on me. She'd been trying to exclude my kids from family gatherings for years. One of her texts still stands out in my memory. Mom and Dad gave you everything, and this is how you repay them. By abandoning them when they need you most. You always were selfish. Laura's turned you against your own blood. I hope you're happy now that you've broken Mom's heart. I almost wrote back pointing out that if they'd given me everything, why had I been paying their mortgage for the last decade? But I knew engaging would just drag me back into their toxic orbit. So I blocked her and tried to focus on my actual family, the one I'd made, not the one I'd been born into. Then came the call I'd been expecting. Diane's voice dripped with desperation when I answered. Melissa's been let go from her job. They're accusing her of stealing from the company. We need your help. I barked out a laugh, drawing a curious look from Laura, who was folding laundry across the room. Of course you do. Not calling to apologize, just calling because you need cash. She was falsely accused, and now your father and I can't make the mortgage payment. Melissa was helping us. Everything suddenly clicked into place. They'd been double-dipping, taking my money, while also relying on Melissa's income. They'd bet on 2 horses, and now one had fallen. Wait, I thought Melissa just got promoted to regional manager last month. That's what you were bragging about at Uncle Dave's barbecue. Diane's voice turned frantic. She's had money troubles, needed advances on her salary. But that's not important right now. We need $3,800 for the mortgage by Thursday. No, I said simply. The word felt foreign in my mouth when directed at my mother, but also strangely empowering. The silence on the other end was almost satisfying. What do you mean? No, I mean no. N-O. I'm done sending money. Not 1 more cent, but we'll lose the house. Her voice had risen to that shrill pitch that used to make me instantly comply with whatever she wanted. Then you'll lose the house. I hung up, surprised by how steady my hand was. The weekly sessions with my therapist had prepared me for this moment, but it still felt surreal to finally enforce a boundary. Laura sat beside me, putting her hand on my knee. You okay? I nodded, feeling lighter than I had in years. Yeah, I think I finally am. Over dinner that night, I explained to Laura exactly what had happened at my parents' house and the subsequent phone call. She listened without interrupting, twirling spaghetti around her fork thoughtfully. You know they're going to escalate, right? She said when I'd finished. This isn't going to be the end of it. I nodded, pushing a meatball around my plate. I know, but I'm done letting them manipulate me. I'm done being their personal bank. Laura reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you. It's about time. Her green eyes were steady and supportive. She'd been telling me for years that my relationship with my parents was unhealthy, but had never pushed too hard, knowing I needed to come to the realization myself. I just keep thinking about the kids, I said. I don't want them growing up thinking it's normal to be treated like second-class citizens by their own grandparents. They have other grandparents, Laura pointed out. My parents adore them and show it. It was true. Laura's parents, though they lived 3 states away, made consistent efforts to be involved in our children's lives. They never missed a birthday, called weekly just to chat with the kids, and saved all year to take us on a family vacation each summer. They weren't wealthy people. Her dad was a retired high school teacher, and her mom still worked part-time as a librarian. But they gave what really mattered: genuine love and attention. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, and it made me wonder why I'd spent so many years chasing approval from parents who had never really seen me. 4 days later, my phone rang at 10:30 p.m. Richard had chest pains. Diane was hysterical, but still didn't call an ambulance. Jack, your father's clutching his chest. What should I do? I was already grabbing my car keys, my heart pounding. Despite everything, I couldn't ignore a potential heart attack. The thought of my father dying with things unresolved between us sent a spike of panic through me. Call 911, Mom, right now. But ambulances cost a fortune, she whimpered. Can't you just come drive him? You're only 20 minutes away. I stood in my hallway, keys in hand, stunned silent. Even with Richard potentially having a heart attack, she was worried about money first. It was so typical that I almost laughed. Call the darn ambulance, Mom, now. I'll meet you at Memorial Hospital. I drove to the hospital with my hands clenched tightly on the wheel, a storm of emotions whirling through me: worry for my father's health, anger at my mother's priorities, guilt for not immediately jumping in my car to help, and frustration that even a medical emergency was somehow being used to manipulate me. It was all there, churning in my gut, like bad takeout. The emergency room was chaotic as usual on a Thursday night. Drunk college kids with minor injuries, elderly patients looking confused and frightened, and harried nurses trying to manage it all. I spotted my mother in the waiting area, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that had seen better days. Where is he? I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. They took him back right away, she sniffed. They said it might be his heart. I nodded, taking a seat a few chairs away from her. We sat in uncomfortable silence for almost an hour before a doctor emerged looking for the family of Richard Thompson. Your father's stable, the doctor told us. It wasn't a heart attack. His EKG and troponin levels are normal. What he experienced was an anxiety attack combined with his chronically high blood pressure. We're giving him something to help him relax now, and I'm adjusting his blood pressure medication. We'd like to keep him overnight for observation, just to be safe. He can be discharged in the morning provided his blood pressure stabilizes. The most important thing is reducing stress in his life. The doctor gave us a meaningful look as if he'd somehow divined the family drama in play. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. I hadn't realized just how worried I'd been until the tension drained from my shoulders all at once. As I was handling the discharge paperwork and paying the emergency room visit fee because, of course, they forgot their insurance card, Diane appeared at my elbow. The mortgage is due tomorrow, Jack. I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. Her husband had just had a health scare serious enough to send him to the emergency room, and all she cared about was the mortgage payment. Did you hear what the doctor just said about lowering stress? Maybe worrying less about money would help. How are we supposed to not worry about money when you've abandoned us? We are your parents. I looked at her, really looked at this small, shrewd woman who had given birth to me but had never truly supported me, who had always viewed me as a resource rather than a son. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the calculating look in her eyes, the way she was assessing whether this crisis could be leveraged to reopen my wallet. Yes, you are my parents. And parents should love all their children equally. They should care about all their grandchildren equally. They should build their kids up, not tear them down to elevate their favorite. She blinked, rapidly, tears forming not from hurt, I realized, but from the dawning recognition that her meal ticket was walking away. We've always loved you, Jack. No, you've always used me. There's a difference. I handed her the discharge instructions and walked out past the waiting room, full of actual emergencies. Driving home at midnight, I called Laura to update her. He's okay. It was an anxiety attack, not a heart attack. Thank goodness. She said, genuine relief in her voice despite her feelings about my parents. Are you coming home now? Yeah, but get this. Mom asked about the mortgage payment while I was paying the emergency room bill. Laura's sigh was audible even through the car speakers. Of course she did. Are you okay? I thought about it for a moment. Yeah, actually I think I am. It's like seeing her try to manipulate me, even in a crisis, just confirms I'm making the right choice. Come home, she said softly. I'll wait up. When I pulled into our driveway 20 minutes later, the porch light was on, and Laura was sitting on the front steps, 2 mugs of herbal tea steaming beside her. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes. This was what real family looked like, someone who genuinely cared about your well-being, not what you could do for them. 2 weeks later, after the foreclosure notice arrived at my parents' house, My mother made sure to text me a photo of it captioned only with, "See what you've done." My younger brother Kevin called me. At 32, he'd always been the forgotten middle child, not exploited like me, not spoiled like Melissa. "Mom's going ballistic," he said, his voice tired. "Blaming you for everything. Says you abandoned the family when they needed you most." Kevin had always seen through our parents' favoritism. As the middle child, he was mostly ignored, in some ways worse than my experience. At least I got attention, even if it was mostly to ask for money. Kevin was just forgotten. "You holding up okay?" I asked. We weren't as close as we could be. My parents had done a good job making sure their children never formed a united front, but I still cared about him. He sighed heavily. "I'm looking for my own place. Can't stand living here anymore. Mom keeps trying to get me to call you about the money." Kevin had moved back home after a rough divorce 2 years ago, supposedly to get back on his feet. But my parents had made it so comfortable for him. No rent. No expectations that he'd gotten stuck in a holding pattern. "Don't let them drag you into this mess." "I won't. But Jack, there's something you should know. That money you've been sending for their mortgage, a lot of it was going to Melissa." My grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean Melissa's been in debt for years? Online gambling. She'd blow through everything, then run crying to mom and dad. They've been giving her your mortgage money, then guilting you into sending more." The betrayal cut deep, though I should have seen it coming. They hadn't just favored Melissa. They'd actively deceived me to fund her addiction. "Thanks for telling me, Kev. And if you need a place to crash while apartment hunting, my door's open." I meant it too. Despite our complicated history, he was still my brother, and maybe without our parents' toxic influence, we could actually build a real relationship. When Kevin showed up 3 days later with just 2 duffel bags and his laptop, I knew things at the house had gotten bad. He looked exhausted with dark circles under his eyes and a defeated slump to his shoulders that reminded me too much of myself a few months ago. That night over pizza, he filled me in on the whole mess, how Melissa had been fired for borrowing money from the company accounts to cover gambling debts, how our parents had been funneling my support to her for years, and how they'd been lying about home repairs and medical bills to squeeze extra cash from me. The roof repair last month, Kevin said, around a mouthful of pepperoni pizza, that was for Melissa's car down payment. And the water heater before that, that was to cover her credit card minimum payments after she maxed out 3 cards at online casinos. I felt sick, not just at being lied to, but at the realization of how deep this deception went. It wasn't just favoring one child over another, it was a years-long conspiracy to extract money from me under false pretenses. "They don't think they did anything wrong," Kevin said, shaking his head. "They genuinely believe you owe them. Like it's not even a question in their minds. You're supposed to support them because they raised you." End of story. "Well, they're about to learn a hard lesson about consequences," I replied, feeling the weight of responsibility for my brother now too. But unlike the burden of supporting my parents, this felt right. This was family helping. Family, not family, exploiting family. Kevin stayed in our guest room for the next week, gradually opening up more about the toxic environment he'd been living in, how our parents constantly compared him unfavorably to both Melissa and me, how they dismissed his web development career as playing with computers, and how they'd sabotaged his efforts to move out by creating dramatic crises whenever he started looking at apartments. "It's like they need to keep us all dependent on them somehow," he said one night as we sat on the back deck after the kids had gone to bed. "They helped trash my marriage too. Did you know that? They'd call Tanya at all hours with emergencies, tell her I wasn't supporting them enough, make her feel guilty for wanting a normal life. I hadn't known. I'd been so caught up in my own struggle with them that I'd missed how they were doing the same thing to Kevin, just in a different way. I'm sorry, man. I should have seen it." He shrugged. "We were all blind to it in different ways. That's how they wanted it. Divide and conquer, you know?" It was the first real conversation we'd had in years, maybe ever, without the toxic influence of our parents hovering over us. We were finally able to see each other clearly, and I realized I actually liked my brother. He was smart, insightful, and had a dry sense of humor that came out when he wasn't being crushed under our parents' disapproval. By the end of the week, he'd found an apartment and a better-paying job at a tech startup downtown. I helped him move in, and we made plans to have dinner weekly, just the two of us rebuilding a relationship that had been stunted by our upbringing. A week later, Diane showed up unannounced at my door. It was a Saturday morning, and I'd just gotten back from taking the kids to their swimming lessons. Her normally perfect bob was disheveled, her eyes red and swollen. "We're going to lose the house, Jack," she said without preamble. "Is that what you want? To see your parents homeless at their age?" I leaned against the doorframe, my 6'2" frame effectively blocking the entrance. Years of hitting the gym had paid off not just physically, but in the confidence it gave me to stand my ground. What I wanted was acknowledgement, to be valued. What I wanted was for my children to be treated with the same love and respect as Melissa's kids. This isn't about sibling rivalry. This is about our home. Her voice had risen to that familiar shrill pitch that used to make me instantly cave to her demands. "No, this is about consequences," I said evenly. "For years, you took my money while treating me like an outsider. You misused funds I sent for your mortgage to bail out Melissa. You rejected my children while embracing hers." Her expression hardened with anger. "We raised you, fed. You put clothes on your back. You owe us. There it was, the toxic belief that had poisoned everything that I owed them simply for doing the basic duties of parenthood. I owe you nothing. Not anymore. I closed the door in her face, watching through the side window as she pounded on it for several minutes, her mouth moving with words I couldn't hear and didn't care to. Eventually she left and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Laura emerged from the kitchen where she'd been discreetly listening. You okay? I nodded, surprised to find it was true. Yeah. Actually, I feel free. That night, Kevin called. They kicked me out because I wouldn't beg you for money, he said, his voice shaking. Dad said if I wasn't going to help save the house, I wasn't welcome to visit anymore. What about your stuff? I asked, concerned. I got most of it out when I moved to the apartment, thankfully. But they're still holding some of my childhood things hostage. Dad said I can have them back when I come to my senses and help the family. I'm sorry, Kev. That's messed up. It's fine, he said, not very convincingly. It's just stuff. But I'm done with them too. I can't believe it took me this long to see how toxic they are. We talked for a while longer, making plans for him to join us for Sunday dinner the next day. When I hung up, I found Laura watching me with a proud smile. What I asked. You're really doing it, she said. You're breaking the cycle. That night I slept better than I had in years. It's been 8 months since I closed the door on Diane. Richard had a stroke 3 months ago. It was Melissa who called, her voice trembling as she told me he was asking for me. Laura and I were at a weekend getaway at a cabin by the lake, our first real vacation in years without the constant drain of my parents' emergencies. I felt my blood pressure spike when I saw Melissa's name on my phone. What do you want to do? Laura asked, her hand covering mine across the small table. I stared at the message, torn between decades of conditioning and my new boundaries. I'm not even sure this is real, I admitted. They've manipulated me before just to get me back on the hook. Laura nodded. Why don't you call the hospital directly? Confirm he's actually admitted before you make any decisions. It was solid advice. I made the call, and surprisingly, Richard really was hospitalized after a massive stroke. This wasn't completely fabricated. We cut our weekend short and drove the 2 hours back to town. Walking through the hospital entrance, Laura squeezed my hand, her silent way of saying I wasn't facing this alone. Melissa was in the waiting room, mascara streaked down her face. Diane sat nearby, looking 10 years older than when I'd last seen her. Kevin was notably absent. They hadn't bothered to include him. You came, Melissa said, sounding genuinely surprised. She looked terrible, thin and drawn, with that slight twitchiness that comes from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. The gambling addiction had clearly taken its toll. I'm not here for you, I said flatly. I'm here because a man might be dying. Diane stood shakily. Jack, thank goodness. He's been asking for you. Where's Kevin? I asked. Did anyone bother to call him? They exchanged guilty looks that told me everything I needed to know. I'll call him myself, I said, pulling out my phone. When I was led to Richard's room, I was shocked by what I saw. The imposing man who had loomed over my childhood lay shrunken in the hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting him to beeping machines. His right side was completely paralyzed, and his speech was slurred but understandable. Son, he rasped when he saw me, his functioning hand reaching out. I didn't take it. The nurse said you were coming, wanted to see you while I still had time, he struggled to say. I stood silently waiting for more words, maybe an apology. Maybe some acknowledgement of the damage he'd caused, but there was nothing. Need your help, he managed finally. For the medical bills. Your mother can't manage alone. His request hit me like a sucker punch. Even now, even here, this was about money. Not reconnecting. Not making peace. Just another attempt to turn on the cash flow. Is this seriously why you called me here? For money? Confusion crossed his face. Family helps family. Not in this family, I replied calmly. In this family, I give, and you take. That system is over. I turned to leave, my chest tight. Not because of his stroke, but from mourning the father I'd never really had, Jack. His voice turned desperate. Please. I stopped at the door but didn't turn around. I'll cover today's medical bills. After that, we're done. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths. A passing nurse asked if I was okay. I nodded silently, not trusting my voice. When I returned to the waiting room, Diane rushed toward me. What did he say? Is he speaking clearly? Is he alert? He's alert, I answered, my voice sounding distant to my own ears and still obsessed with money. Her face crumpled with despair. The insurance is barely covering anything and we have bills piling up, rent to pay. I'll take care of today's hospital charges, I said firmly. That's all. Melissa stepped forward, eyes narrowed. He's your father. He raised you. Did he? I asked, looking between these two women who had played central roles in my life, but had never truly seen me. Because from where I'm standing, all he did was demand and take. As I walked away, Diane's voice rose to a begging whine. Jack, please, you're all we have left. I stopped but didn't turn around. No, you don't need me. You need my wallet. That's very different. 3 weeks later, Diane showed up at my workplace. I was heading to my car after a long day of client meetings when I spotted her waiting by my Range Rover, looking small and defeated. What do you want? I asked, keeping my distance. We're being evicted next week, she said, not meeting my eyes. Richard's medical bills, the missed mortgage payments, it's all caught up with us. I said nothing, just waited. Melissa's gone to stay with a friend in Colorado, she continued, her voice breaking. She said she can't deal with the stress anymore. Of course she'd abandoned them the minute they couldn't support her anymore. I have nowhere to go. Jack, Diane whispered, finally looking up with tears in her eyes. I'm begging you, if not for me, then for your father. He's still in rehab and they'll discharge him soon. We'll be on the street. For a moment, just a moment, I felt that old familiar pull, the guilt, the obligation. Then I remembered Tyler's face when he realized his grandparents didn't want him at their table. I remembered Emma asking why Grandma didn't like them. There's a decent senior living facility on Oakwood Drive, I said finally. I'll pay for 3 months. That's it. After that, you're on your own. Her face showed shock, then anger, then grudging acceptance. You'd really do this to your own mother? No, Mom. You did this to yourself. I got in my car and drove home to my family, my real family, the one I'd chosen and built with love instead of obligation. That night, as Laura and I sat on the deck watching Tyler and Emma play with the dog in the backyard, she asked if I was okay. Yeah, I said, realizing I meant it. For the first time in my adult life, I think I actually am. Kevin's been doing well too. He's got a steady girlfriend now, someone he met through work. He comes over for dinner at least once a week, and he's great with the kids. Tyler especially looks up to him. They bond over video games and coding projects. It's like we're building the family we should have had all along. Mom and Dad ended up taking my offer on the senior living facility. They didn't have much choice. They were literally days away from being homeless. Melissa never came back from Colorado. Last I heard from Kevin, who still gets occasional updates from a cousin, she's working as a bartender and still gambling whatever she can. Some people never change. Dad's health deteriorated pretty quickly after the stroke. The doctors say he probably won't live more than another year. Sometimes I feel guilty about that, but then I remember that his health problems were largely self-inflicted. Decades of stress, poor diet, refusing to follow medical advice, and treating everyone around him like garbage. You reap what you sow. Mom tries to contact me every couple of weeks, usually with some new crisis or guilt trip. The senior living facility is too small. The other residents are beneath her. Dad needs some experimental treatment that insurance won't cover. It's always something. I've set up an email filter that sends her messages straight to a folder I check when I'm in the right headspace, which isn't often. The irony is that if they had just treated me, and more importantly my children, with basic decency and respect, I would have happily continued supporting them. They could have had a comfortable retirement, regular visits from grandchildren who adored them, family holiday gatherings, all of it. Instead, they chose to play favorites, to manipulate, to exploit, and now they're facing the consequences of those choices. Sometimes people ask if I miss my parents. I don't. What I miss is the idea of parents loving, supportive people who want the best for their kids. But that's not what I had. What I have now is freedom. What I have now is a home where all children are equally welcome. What I have now is the certainty that I've broken the cycle. My kids will never know what it feels like to be valued only for their usefulness. Sometimes family isn't who raised you. It's who you choose to surround yourself with after you discover your worth. I chose myself. I chose my children. I chose honesty over manipulation. And I've never looked back.